I said, won't it be a time? Oh, won't it be a time? Oh, won't it be a time? Oh, talking with the angels. Won't it be a time? You can help me. Let one more time. I said, won't it be a time? Oh, won't it be a time?
Shalom, saints, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. Want to go ahead and say shalom all around to everybody who is currently in the live chat. If you are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. And remember to leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, or anything of that nature in the comment section down below. Want to go ahead and say, if you guys want to follow me on various social media platforms, you can do so. I have links to all of those in the description down below. I am on Facebook, Twitter, Truth Social, Gab, all the different places where you can find stuff. If you're on those different places and can find stuff, follow me at the synagogue, share this video. Very much appreciate anybody who is doing those things. Got a couple other links we want to let you guys know about that are in that description. First off, if anybody wants to support the work that I do here, there are numerous ways to do that in the description down below. We have links to a PayPal if anybody would like to give a one-time donation. We have link to the Patreon. By the way, if anybody joins the Tea Party tier on the Patreon for $5 monthly, you will get access to my bi-weekly breakfast tea video blog. It is, of course, addressing issues of apologetics, theology, religion, and things of that nature. But they are shorter, more edited videos where I write out my thoughts and then read them to you guys. Gotten a lot of really positive feedback on those. If you guys are interested, next one's going to be aired this Sunday or Saturday. It's bi-weekly on the weekends. We don't have a specific day that we drop it. But nevertheless, if you guys are interested in that, that's a way that you can contribute and also get something tangible for your contribution. And I have a link to my book as well, 15 Questions for Calvinists Answered, which you can also find down there in the description. That's another way you can also get some sort of a product if you want it for your contribution, right? So I appreciate anybody who's doing any of that stuff. Links to the other two channels can be found at the bottom as well. Both my music channel as well as my news/politics channel can be found in descriptions below. And a link to my guests podcast today can be found in the description down below. We'll get to the guests in a moment, but if they interest you, or if you're watch this video and say, hey, those guys brought up some good points, or maybe they didn't bring up some good points and I just want to rage watch, I don't care why you do it. There is a link in the description down below for that. We got a couple things. Actually, since we are doing this video today, we actually only have one thing coming up as far as the channel housekeeping is concerned, which is my debate February the 4th, 6 p.m. Mountain Time on Standing for Truth's YouTube channel. Again, that's February the 4th, 6 p.m. Mountain Time on Standing for Truth's YouTube channel. What will we be debating, you ask, hypothetically? Glad you did so, Jimmy. We are going to be debating whether or not the Bible teaches that there was death before the fall of Adam. Was there any animal death before the fall of Adam according to the Scriptures? It's not a scientific debate. It is a theological debate, okay? I want to be clear on that. Nevertheless, that is going to be, again, 6 p.m. Mountain Time over on Standing for Truth's channel, February 4th. I will be taking the negative. I do not believe there was animal death before the fall according to Scripture. And my opponent will be a gentleman by the name of Adam, and he is going to be taking the position that, in fact, there was. And he's, of course, as you might be able to guess, either an old earth creationist or a theistic evolutionist. I'm not really sure which, to be honest with you. I'm not super familiar with Adam Terry. I've watched a couple of his debates on the Standing for Truth YouTube channel. But it seems like he's a little bit of a newcomer. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but it just means that I'm not familiar with a bunch of his positions as of yet. Anyways, though, I hope you guys like that video and debate and all that. I think it's going to be a really good one. That's pretty much all we have for the channel housekeeping as far as things coming up today. There are things I'd like to talk about, just simply can't, right? The David Paulman debate is still up in the air. The William Albrecht debate is still up in the air. Yada, yada, so on and so forth. Let's go ahead and jump right in to our prayer for today. And then we got a very interesting video for you guys, friends. I got 2 guests joining us today. And yeah, I think this is going to be a ton of fun. So let's go ahead and jump into this. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you once again for the opportunity to make these videos. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to my guests here today and for the opportunity for us to speak in front of an audience like this that will be able to weigh our arguments and see whether or not they be true, whether or not they be rational. I want to pray that this be edifying for your body and glorifying to your name, Lord, and I pray that you just bless this video in however way you see fit. In Jesus Christ's name I pray and give you the glory, Lord. Amen. All righty. I have 1 guest and I have 2 guests. These gentlemen are from the Canadian Atheist podcast. Now, you guys who watch this channel a long time may be familiar with at least one of them, i.e. Micheal. Shalom, Micheal.
Hey.
Dean is joining us here today. He is actually Michael's co-host on the Canadian Atheist podcast. And shalom to you, Dean.
Dean,
now,
you're muted, buddy.
Oh, I didn't even
That is
realize
true. I was muted. How do you do?
Yeah, I saw the wave. I thought that was all you were doing. That's partially my bad. So let's go ahead and get some brief introductions from you guys so that our audience knows who you are. We'll go with Dean first, since this is your first time here. And then Micheal, if you'd like to just pick up as soon as he stops, floor is your guys'.
Okay, well, thank you for having me on. I'm Dean. Not really much to say. Michael and I started this podcast. We're both atheists. We both are on that side of the fence, I guess you would say. Michael took it upon himself to set it all up, and I just show up in his studio every once in a while, or join from home, as I'm doing today. And we've had a lot of fun doing this. Had a lot of guests on most recently, and that's always excellent to get viewpoints from other brains, and we've had it on both sides of the fence. We've had some of the greatest scientists like Lawrence Krauss on, and we've had a lot of apologetics like yourself on, and continue to do this for as long as we can, and fight the good fight.
That's right. Yeah. Dean is my more reasonable partner. He keeps me sane. And yeah, we started this little bitty thing called the Canadian Atheist a little over 7 years ago now. And CJ, you've been gracious enough to come on. I think it's 3 times, if not more than that, and been gracious enough to host us. I have to say again, CJ, brother, I got to get you a better picture because you have fat Micheal on the for that, and that is 100 pounds ago. So I have to get you better pictures for that. But that's my bad. Yeah, we are fortunate enough to have amazing guests, again, like yourself and many others, and they make the show really what it is. When we're not doing that, we're doing some news episodes and making fun of some very, very silly things that some people say.
Even recently, we've had news episodes with guests.
Exactly. Yeah. Most recently at that, which has been a boatload of chuckles. Love that so much.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just been so amazing, and we're humbled by just how many people want to tune into a foul-mouthed Canadian and his reasonable friend. Because although I don't do it here out of respect, I do let a strip fly. If anyone is interested, the capodcast.ca is where you can find all of our episodes.
And you will most likely be hearing more of Michael's voice than mine, because I'm not on every episode, just because I have a family and a real job. And
Dean has the real
always
job.
There.
But no, it's whenever if you do go back to see some of the conversations, for example, that CJ we had with CJ, anytime a guest on, specifically a Christian guest, it is always clean because we want to be respectful to the guest, and we also want them to be able to share it with their audience. And if it's just me throwing F-bombs all over the place, that's probably not it. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking now. And, otherwise, Dean and I are just going to take over and say, hi, this is episode number whatever the Canadian Atheist looks like.
Yeah, and I appreciate you guys giving those introductions there, and appreciate having you on here as well. This is, as you said, I think you were probably the second most frequent guest I have on here after Chris Date. I haven't actually tallied up each of your guys' appearances on here, but they're both over 5. I know that much. Wow. And then, of course, with Dean, this is the first time we've actually been speaking on here.
Yeah, check mark next to my name.
Yeah, for sure. So it's definitely cool here. Now, we don't have a specific topic for today. What we do have is a series of interactions over on the interwebs, where we were going back and forth on various stuff, and wanted to have a conversation on it. You typically in the socio-political realm, but not necessarily exclusively. So what I want to go ahead and do here is be a good house guest, so to speak, right? Go ahead and let you guys have the floor as far as where you'd like to steer this conversation to begin. And we're kind of just, this is, think of this almost like the Joe Rogan podcast in a way, right? In the sense that we don't actually have a topic. We're just kind of going to go until we feel like not going anymore.
Well, if it's Joe Rogan, I'm just going to log off now because I don't pay attention to him. But,
not anymore, at least. I used to.
Yeah. But no, it's interesting as typical fashion would have it. CJ and I, and this time with Dean as well, before we hit the record button, we were riffing for about 20 to 25 minutes on some really interesting topics. And they were like, let's go live. But it was, I mean, we kind of, tapped on morality a little bit, and we talked about, kind of the presuppositionalist approach and riffed on that a little bit. So, I mean, morality is always a fun topic. So we could dive into that if you wanted. That's all. That'll always get the comment section going lively.
Yeah, absolutely. That might not be a bad idea as far as that's going to allow us to jump into a lot of the peripheral topics as well. So, let me kind of lay out a little bit of my feelings on morality. Of course, I think this might be review for some people, but nevertheless, so I tend to be an objectivist and a deontologist and a divine command theorist, which are 3 different terms with 3 different meanings, albeit related. So what do those things mean, Jay? Well, objectivist would mean that I think morality is a set of, you could call it true facts, right? In other words, if I say you shouldn't steal something, that has a value of true or false, actually, right? Rather than a value of, has society deemed it to be so? Is it beneficial for us biologically speaking, or societally speaking, or culturally speaking? Is everything all subjective? Do the means justify the ends? Those kinds of things, right? So I would say that morality is objective. And I would also tack onto that, I do tend to think of morality as absolute. I think that it's not that there's not room for consequentialism on my view. I would actually argue there is no room for consequentialism on any other view, to be honest. I don't think you can say the means justify the ends if you haven't defined what morality is, because who's to say that those are good means and bad means? It seems to me like you just kick the can down the road. So that's the first area there. Second thing, deontologist. I tend to see morality as a system of not simply oughts and ought nots, rules and principles, etc., but of duties, right? I have a duty to do this, that, and the third, and a duty to not do this, that, and the third, right? Which then leads into that third word, divine command theory. I think that the way human beings most clearly understand what is moral and what is not is through the commands of a God. I don't think that necessarily is the basing or the grounding of those morals, right? In other words, what God's reasons are for saying one thing is moral and one thing is not is another question unto itself. But I think the way that we most clearly and properly understand morality is through commands, and the ultimate commander, in my view, would of course be the divine commander. So that's at least a way to kick the ball down the field. And yeah, let's just go ahead and jump from there.
Dean, go ahead.
No, I like the way you. I believe the same way as you do, and I like the way you put it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we could not. If what CJ just said and what Dean and I feel would be, I think, a perfect definition of diametrically opposed. Shocker. But yeah, it is. So yeah, so the idea of objective morality, I think the first thing we have to dive into is how would you define objective? Because a typical definition is mind or stance independent.
Right. And I would say I would hold to that. I tend to say it a little bit differently only because there can be a little bit of caveating when we say mind or stance independent. Mind or stance independent for us. In other words, because a lot of people might say, well, isn't God a mind? And that's not an unfair point, except I don't think it really does a whole lot to address the issue of morality for human beings, especially considering the different qualifications that different deists and theists will give to God. For example, if he's unchanging, does the fact that he has a mind even really matter, right? So I tend to define objective as morality is a matter of fact, right? The same way that gravity is a matter of fact, 2 + 2 = 4 is a matter of fact. You should not steal is a matter of fact. So that's kind of the way I tend to look at it.
Yeah, so we can't. Yeah, unfortunately, we can't have a meeting of the minds when it comes to that, because if you're so, I mean, I appreciate you not just saying, not doing what some apologists have done that I've spoken to, and that is dive right into the fallacy of special pleading by say human minds, right? Because there are so many people who will say that God is a mind, right? Is a creative mind, right? There are many problems with that. One, we have no examples of minds without bodies, without physical brains, so that's a problem. But to say that it is different for people, right, is just to use an atypical definition of the word, right? Now, if I want to do an internal critique and step inside what you believe, there's nothing inconsistent with what you believe, right? But if you do me the same courtesy and step inside from my perspective, then you just see the litany of issues with the position that you're taking. The second point that you made was from a standpoint of deontology. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that as a concept, but I think we'll get there from different ends, like from different points. We may come close to a convergence on at least some of those areas, but not all of them, obviously. And the last one you said, being a divine command theorist is the most troubling part of what you said, right? Because from our perspective is, it's like, which horn of Euthyphro are you going to take, right? And for those who aren't aware, the Euthyphro dilemma is basically, does God declare something good because it is good? Like, does he see and say, this is a good thing, like it says in the Bible? God saw what was going on and declared that it was good during the creation in Genesis? Or is it good simply because God says that it is good, right? And the problem with either one of those is you're cooked at either off-ramp. If you take the first off-ramp and God sees something, then it is external to him and therefore subjective to nature. If you take the second ramp and say, well, it's good because anything that God says is good, then anything God says is good is good, right? So therefore, if God would command anything, it would by definition be good. And if that's the case, then the God that we're talking about is morally inferior to all three of us. Because all three of us would not do things that are depicted in the Bible. None of us would. Not one.
So I think there's a couple interesting points that I would kind of want to address there. I think the first one, as it pertains to divine command theory, one of the reasons I word it the way I do, to back up a little, it was I think the way humans most clearly understand morality is via commands, and of course the ultimate commander being the divine commander. And the reason I tend to word it that way is because I don't think that necessarily is the same as saying what makes something good or not good is whether or not it is commanded. It's a little bit of a semantic thing, but there's a very distinct difference, right? So as an example, it could be true that, say, we'll take the stealing example, stealing is wrong, right? And one might be able to figure out that stealing is wrong in various different ways. Maybe one just thinks about it for a long period of time. I think for the most part, moral philosophers tend to agree that stealing is wrong even 3,000 years ago before any of them got access to a book that at that point would only be in the ancient Near East, right? But the clearest understanding of what and why that rule exists, what it is and why it exists, I think would come from the command, don't do this, and the grounding of that command, I'm the ultimate authority and I said don't do this, right? But that is ultimately separated from the question of why did you command don't do this? And there it allows us to still have a little bit more answers, right? So for example, I would make the argument that from a deistic perspective or theistic perspective, I should say theistic because deistic is not what I believe, that moral commands ultimately arise either from God's nature or from God's position of authority. The ones that are from God's nature are fairly obvious. These would be things that reflect his character. And the ones that would be from his position of authority would be there are things that he's allowed to do that we are not. So, for example, accepting worship, right? He is the being who is in the position of authority, the position of worship, the position of praise. So it is lawful and just for him to accept that, but we are not in that position. Ergo, it is not lawful and just for us to accept that. And if anybody wants a comparison of that, you could just think of, like, I always use the kidnapping analogy, I call it. If I found somebody stealing from somebody else and I beat them up and handcuffed them and threw them in a room for 5 to 10 years, I'm going to prison. But if I have a badge and I do that with the force of law, and of course after a trial and all that kind of stuff, I'm doing my job, right? So one's position of authority can determine whether or not one's actions are considered morally just, even though they are the exact same actions, right? Now, as it pertains to the issue of, well, maybe I should pin on that and let you guys respond to what I just said, because I think you brought up a good point with the he can command absolutely anything, but I also just said quite a bit there, so maybe I can pause there and let you jump on that.
I was going to say when you were saying that God's nature is one of them. How do you know what God's nature is?
I think revelation through the Bible. I think there are ways you can do it naturally as well. It is interesting if you look at a lot of the Greek and Far Eastern and Iranian philosophers, a lot of them don't exactly agree with each other, but they tend to. And the Bible also tends to agree with them as well. So there is a manner of speaking in which you could say natural law exists, and we can figure that out through wise inquiry. But it's muddy and it's difficult, and I don't think everybody comes to the exact same conclusions, even though
that's just it. Everybody through revelation or studying the Bible, everybody would come to a different conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, like you get, I mean, denominational differences is just the easiest way to point that out, right? You're a Calvinist, right?
Right.
So, you know, you put a Calvinist next to I don't know, an Anglican, right? I'm assuming you think Anglicans are Christian.
Well, yes, but I would say use like a Methodist. Technically, by the definition we use of the word Calvinist, Anglicans are Calvinists. Now, they're not Calvinist in the classical definition, but they believe in like predestination, for example, and the five-pointed tulip and those.
Methodist, Presbyterian, any of those flavors?
Methodist would not be Calvinist. So
Right.
that would be a good example.
So, you know, and yet you would still accept Methodists as like if you met a Methodist, you would accept that person as a brother or sister in Christ, yes?
Yeah.
Right? And yet there are fundamental differences, like outside of the gospel messages, right, which you would both agree on. There are fundamental differences in your individual theologies, both of which you will use passages from the same book to defend different standpoints and different opinions.
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent that sort of thing is to be expected. I know that may sound like it's a little bit contrary to what I was just saying about natural law, but I think that there is, well, first let me say that as it pertains to morality, that tends to not be true. With respect to progressive Christians, I don't think if you put me and a progressive Christian in a room, we're going to disagree about what the Bible says. Rather, we're going to disagree about whether or not.
No, and it's really interesting because when I think about progressive Christianity, I like speaking as someone who was a Christian, right? Mm-hmm. Oh no, let's take a really non-controversial subject like gay marriage, right? There is no ambiguity in Leviticus
at all, right?
None. And yet, there is a church not. Well, Dean, it's probably 15 minutes from you. It's 5 minutes from me. That every June flies a pride flag, and 12 months of the year, sitting outside of their doors, is a bench painted in the pride colors. And as I drive by it semi-regularly. And I drive by it, I'm just like, you've never read the Bible, have you?
Right.
Like you've never, or you are using the Bible like a cafeteria, right? Christopher Hitchens said, that religion is like the great cafeteria, where you go through and you take the things you like and you leave you things you don't. Because again, there is no ambiguity. So you're not going to, you and the Methodist will agree on, again, like I said, the gospel message, but someone else who labels himself a progressive Christian or whatever label you want to put on, will be accepting of they may even perform same-sex marriages, right?
And I think that,
and you would say that's blasphemous.
Well, and that's true,
or heretical.
But I would also kind of say, I think that, with respect to the progressive, I know there are a lot who do their darndest to try and make a convincing case. But in my opinion, that's a picture perfect example of what we would call cognitive dissonance, right? And I probably worded that a little weird, as if you guys don't know what cognitive dissonance is. Sorry, but you know what I mean? Like like you say, there's absolutely no ambiguity as it pertains to things like gay marriage, things like patriarchy, things like even one that I get in a lot of trouble for, because I am a little bit more willing to be, I don't want to say honest with the text. I don't want to bash on my fellow apologist out here, but slavery. I mean, let's just be very honest about it. Slavery is not in the Bible the thing that you probably wish it was as a 2025 American/Canadian or what have you, right? But the thing is, I don't actually know that I believe other people genuinely think, like when they read Leviticus 25 or Leviticus 18, I don't think they go, well, it's just so super unclear. You know what I mean? I think that it's more of a, how can I make this fit with the view I already want? Or in the case of somebody like Brendan Robertson, who's a gay affirming pastor, I think he's actually homosexual himself, but I'm not sure about that. He would say something along the lines of, well, it's culturally specific, or perhaps it's, maybe Paul is not writing from direct inspiration. Jesus never said that kind of argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or things of that nature. Like, they try to find ways around it. But as far as, do we have different interpretations of what the text says? Well, not really. You know what I mean?
I think there are some that don't, but there are some that do, which kind of begs the question, though. A verse like God is not the author of confusion. But our dear friend Dr. Josh Bowen, wrote a whole book on this, right? And he's worked with other scholars like Kip Davis, fellow Canuck, and others, to kind of pull this stuff apart. And these are people who are experts in the field. They speak the languages, they understand the context, and they understand the history of that piece of land between the Tigris and Euphrates River in that time period. So there is no, you don't understand the context. Like, you and I are both familiar with Praise I Am.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. He's gone after you quite a bit. He's gone after me quite a bit. He's also had us both on his channel, oddly enough. But anyway, he does what it is you alluded to a few minutes ago, and that is that he understands, and a lot of Christians understand, that when you read, and for anyone who's not familiar, it's Leviticus 25 verses 44 through 46. Again, zero ambiguity in that text, where it talks about precisely how and where, when, and everything about how you can keep slaves, and are frankly expected to. Anyway, I think he understands understands that, how he never goes on camera, but if he did, he'd be shifting in his seat, feeling pretty uncomfortable at exactly what those verses say. And so that's why this whole field of apologetics exists, in order to maybe, and I don't want to be insulting to you, but to romanticize this idea, right? And you have people like try to pull these words out. They go to Bible Gateway and they pull up the Blue Letter Bible and they think Blue Letter Bible and I can piece all these words together. But then again, you have actual scholars who say, no, that's not the context in which these words are used. These people don't know what the hell they're talking about. And they actually present it to you in the way it's intended to be given, in context of the biblical narrative. And they have to make excuses for it.
Yeah, one of the things I try to do with a lot of this, so part of the reason that doesn't necessarily offend me is because I am comfortable with saying, no, I think the Bible actually does condone what I would call it a version of slavery, because I don't think it condones every kind of slavery, no doubt. I think
slavery is moral.
I think that I would say that I think a certain flavor. Let me put it this way: if slaves are given human rights in the court of law, which I know is not something we typically tend to think of because of the way that the European slave trade went, but in Israel and even to a certain extent in Rome, Greece, and Egypt, this was not necessarily a baffling conclusion to reach. I don't think that it's ideal, but I don't think that it's immoral. Like if I own somebody, but I'm not allowed to beat them, kill them, ruin their families, stuff like that. That's one thing, versus if I can own somebody for life, can do whatever I want to them, they're just a table, that kind of thing. And I even kind of think of it like, you don't use the word slavery for a lot of different contracts that we have here in the modern world, but it's the same general idea. You own their labor. They can't get out of that labor.
Well, you own their labor. You don't own them. Slavery is owning a person.
Yeah, and
getting their labor for free.
Yeah, and to be fair,
well, there's nothing about getting their labor for free, right? There's plenty of slaves were paid all throughout history.
Well, yeah, especially Hebrew slaves, right?
Yeah.
But in that portion of Leviticus, it talks about how you can get slaves. It says take slave, but buy slaves and also take slaves from the people who are that are in your lands. When you can take them, you can bequeath them to your family, and they'll be your property. And how if you have a male slave, and then you give that male slave a wife, and that woman has children. In the Jubilee, when the man would go free, the wife and the kids don't, because they belong to the slave owner. And then the man goes to the slave owner and says, I love my wife, I love my children, I don't want to leave them, and they take them into town, and they put the slave at the oar and they pierce his ear with the awl, and he becomes the master's property.
So there's no context or justification to say that owning another human being is moral, in my mind.
So real quick, just a brief correction for Michael. That's actually two different chapters, right? There's Leviticus 25, which talks about the slaves with the Jubilee, and also the slaves from
there's Exodus 21 and then Leviticus.
Exactly, and then Exodus 21 is so. So there we do have two different passages there. So, but nevertheless, the content of what you're talking about is true. Now, there is a couple of things that I think are important to note here. So, for example, number one, the woman and the children are still subject to Jubilee law, right? So there's two different laws in which, biblically speaking, slaves went free. There's the 7-year law, which applies to Hebrew slaves, and that's the one you were just kind of alluding to there, where somebody can decide, hey, I want to put the awl in the ear and be not be subject to that rule any longer. But typically it's 6 years. And then on the 7th, you go free, right?
And according to the Bible, you got to give them money and stuff if they do leave. You have to give them, so that they're not to fall into that need to go into slavery again.
Exactly. Which I appreciate you pointing out there, because I think that's an important element of this conversation. Then the second portion there they have is the Jubilee, right? Which is regardless of when you started in servitude, once every 50 years, there's a Jubilee year, during which time all debts are canceled, during which time all slaves are freed, and so on and so forth, right? And so you could be purchased a year ago, right? Typically, in that instance, if it's a Hebrew, you'd be selling yourself into slavery. There are very strong rules against like man stealing, that calls it in the King James, but kidnapping and selling people into slavery.
Well, the Bible says that you're not to rule over your fellow Israelite with vigor.
Yeah, exactly, and that is another important element too. But even beyond that, it
doesn't apply to the non-Hebrew. That doesn't apply to the non-Hebrew, because if you have a Hebrew slave, sorry to cut you off there. If you have a Hebrew slave, you have to be very careful about how you treat them. But if it's a non-Hebrew slave and you do beat them, it's only if you injure their eyes or their teeth, they can go free. But if you beat them and they die under your hand, you're punished. But if they survive a day or two, then die, you're off the hook.
Well, and this is another area where I think there's a little bit of context. And by the way, you were just bringing up Dr. Josh Bowen.
Yeah.
You could actually probably ask him this. I think he would probably agree with what I'm about to say here. So chip the eye or gouge the tooth is not literal in the sense that it's only those two specific things. It's more of a euphemism to say serious cosmetic damage done to a slave will allow them to go free. Now, bear in mind, this is a society where corporal punishment is pretty well standard. So it's not going to be saying any damage whatsoever, because obviously criminals and employees and stuff like that, this is a very different culture than the one we would live in today, right? But the chip the eye or gouge the tooth thing is not to say, oh, but if you crack the skull, it's fine. Or if you cause a serious broken rib or something like that, that's fine, right? It's more of a euphemistic phrase to say, if you were to beat a slave in such a way that causes serious cosmetic damage, they go free, right?
That's a question I would like to ask Josh.
I'll send him a text later.
If it's true.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if you're beating somebody and you crack a rib or their skull, how do you know at that time? You don't.
Yeah, you wouldn't.
Well, I don't think
if you gouge their eye or chip their tooth or however it's put, they would have difficulty eating. And they'd have difficulty seeing, so they wouldn't be able to do their work. But if you crack a rib, if a rib cracks during a beating, you wouldn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if that would be necessarily true, right? I think that they were. I don't think they were as good as we are with medical tech. Don't get me wrong. But I don't think they were quite as simple as maybe we might tend to think, right? So, like for example, you can see even back to Neanderthal days, evidence of developing medicine and dentistry and things of that nature, right? So by the time you get to like the ancient Near East, roughly 3rd millennium BC, 2nd millennium BC, around there, I'm sure that they had plenty of ways to be able to. I mean, first off, can you walk? I mean, a broken rib is going to take what, 3 weeks, 4 weeks to heal, if not longer. That seems to be, that seems to be indicative of you've caused serious cosmetic damage if you've broken a bone there, because there are things you're going to be prevented from doing, right? You could also, I think, feel somebody. Oh, I can feel the rib moving around in there. You know what I mean? That could be something else you might. Excuse me. Be something else that you might be able to look into, right? And the important thing about it to me is it's not even just you can't do that. That's one thing. The penalty for it is if you do that, they're going to go free, which is rather unique to, in fact, speaking of Dr. Josh, I had a conversation with him on this issue. There are a lot of things about, and he would probably push back on this one, granted. I only point out that I talked to him about it to say he probably remembers this conversation. There are ways in which the Hebrew laws are unique, even compared to other relatively benign laws of the time. So, for example, with the Code of Hammurabi, right? One thing you'll see in Levitical law that you won't see in the Code of Hammurabi is because slavery tends to be a system of getting out of debt or of punishment, as in like a criminal, which we still do in America to this day. I don't know how it is in Canada, but you can still, slavery is still a viable punishment in the United States of America. So, lost my train of thought there. Where was I going? Yes. Since it was typically a system of trying to get people out of debt, as Micheal alluded to, one of the things that you have to do if a slave is to go free is you have to give them provisions in such a way that they will not reasonably be, you cannot reasonably assume they would fall back into this level of debt and servitude again. That's a fairly unique, and you could call it progressive system, not just for the time, but even all the way up into the 1800s. You didn't typically have anything like that, right? Like when slaves were freed in European countries, it was just, okay, bye, have fun with your freedom. You know what I mean? Whereas back then it was like, okay, I'm going to give you this food, I'm going to give you these clothes and raiment, I'm going to give you, this, that, and the third, so that I can have a reasonable expectation that you're not going to come back to me later on.
Yeah, and that wasn't even something that was done, my understanding from the conversations I've had with him and in his book. It talks about how the people at the time, that the subtext was, it's like, I have to give them all this stuff. I'm going to be put out, right? And it talks about in the Bible how basically God says, don't worry about it. I got you. I'll take care of you. I'll make sure you're everything's so bountiful, you'll have more than you ever need. Of course, that didn't happen. But sorry. But yeah, it's just the whole thing is just not something that. And anyway, we may be getting off track a little bit. Yeah, I think I side with what Dean said, and that is that under no circumstances is owning another human being a moral thing to do. And I think if you try to do the whole, well, you're a slave to your employer, or you're a slave to your mortgage, there is no universe where my employer, where Dean's employer, where your employer can take your life for anything.
Well, there's not in the Bible either, though, right? That's punished in Levitical law. And in fact, one interesting thing about the word for punishment that is used there, now this is disputed, I will grant this, but the word for punish that is used in the Bible seems to imply that you will be actually subject to a death penalty. Now, again, I will freely grant that is disputed amongst various understanders of the language. I myself have studied Hebrew for about 2-3 years, but I'm definitely not an expert. So I'll say that while I know some, I don't know maybe as much as, like, I don't know, Kenneth Kitchen, right? But there is definitely there's a good argument to be made that the word there actually implies that you will be punished actually with death. I believe it's Exodus 21, 20? Somebody in the live chat correct me on that. Is it Exodus 21:20? I could just look it up, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess like none of us being biblical scholars, least of all Dean and I, we have to just, claim, I guess, that degree of ignorance, right? Not understanding, not being able to delve into.
Michael, you're saying that our
Yeah.
employers can't kill us, but they also can't whip us if we're not working hard enough in their eyes. If we get married while we're employed with them, and when we leave our employment, they don't get to keep our wives and children.
I almost said something terrible there. But of course I'd be messing around. But yeah, no, yeah, of course that's the case. It's true. It's just, anyway, I think we may have already beaten the slave to death.
So I did, just real briefly, just for the audience sake, it is Exodus 21:20, and the Hebrew word there is nakam, which does literally mean to avenge. But can also be used to mean grudge, take vengeance, take revenge, punish, and so on and so forth. So if that helps anybody, it does. If it doesn't, then I guess we're in the same spot we were just in. But just to clarify, I did decide to look it up.
How is your chat going? I never ever look at the streams or anything. How is your chat going? How many people are yelling at us?
It fluctuates back and forth a lot. The top we've gotten so far on this stream is I saw 16. I may have saw 18, but I was kind of just glancing. Right now we're at 14.
Oh, okay. Hi, people.
I don't know if that's actually people clicking off or not, or if the YouTube stream is just not capable of keeping up all the time. Because sometimes I'll look at the algorithm and it'll be like, oh, your congruent viewers were 25. And it's like, definitely didn't show me that on the screen. So thanks, YouTube. Yeah. But so a question that I think bleeds together these two, the slavery question and the morality question, is, and take this in the spirit in which it is meant, please.
My wife hates it. So just a side note, whenever I say something, whenever I'm about to say, babe, I got to tell you something, please take in the manner in which I intend it. She always gives me side eye. She's like, I'm not going to like this, am I?
I hear that.
Dean knows my wife. So
yeah, I got to say, I feel it. We'll put it that way.
I derailed you there.
My wife is a wonderful woman. I have no complaints whatsoever, but definitely I understand that. You know what I mean?
No complaints? That's surprising.
Well, to be fair, I tend to have a general policy of, like, if whatever you do is less annoying than if whatever my worst problem with you is less annoying than my best problem with one of my good friends who I don't go and talk about, then I got nothing. You know what I mean?
How long have you been married?
Say again?
How long have you been married, CJ?
It's going to be 7 years in June, but I've been with her about 12. We started dating as sophomores.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, Shannon and I have been married for almost 19 years now. Give it time. Give it time. You'll piss each other off enough.
I knew my ex for 20 years before she decided she had enough of me.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess things happen, right?
Yeah. Anyway, you were gonna say.
Yeah, I have a point that I think could bleed these 2 points together, right?
Yeah.
And as I said, do take this in the intention, or in the manner in which I intend it. But how, other than your own personal distaste for it, and maybe that is just the answer, which if it is, that's fine. Let me know. But what is it about, like, how can we say definitively that slavery is not right or wrong, even in the extreme forms of it, right? Like, let's say the Southern style of slavery that was very race-based, where they tended to say you can't read and write, where they didn't pay laborers, where there wasn't as strict of laws against, sexual assault, for example, stuff like that. How is it that we understand that to be wrong? Or the alternative, how do we understand that to be right if somebody were to take that position, right? Like, how can we say one way or the other? Is it simply a matter of pure preference? Is it what benefits the society most? Is it what benefits us as a species most? Like, what would be your answer to that?
I think it's the like, Michael, you probably say this more eloquently than I, but it's the whole well-being factor.
Yeah.
Does it promote well-being? And does it promote or does it stop suffering and promote well-being?
Yeah. So I mean, you've got you've got the promotion of well-being, the reduction of suffering, the involuntary imposition of will upon someone who doesn't consent. You like so it's funny when people ask us this kind of stuff all the time. Oh, you're an atheist. Where do you get your morals from? I'm like, well, not from atheism, right? Atheism doesn't say anything about morality. Atheism itself doesn't say anything about anything other than, on the weak side, do you believe or lack a belief in gods? Or on the strong side, do you positively believe that gods don't exist? Right?
Yeah, I mean, technically, you don't even have to be a naturalist as an atheist.
Yeah, everything else is something else, especially when it comes to morality, right? Because you can find someone who doesn't believe in a god that will steal and not care at all. It won't impact them in any way, shape, or form. They'll consider that an amoral action, right? Whereas myself, I look at it as a grossly immoral action, however, sometimes justifiable. We mentioned before about the idea of stealing something to feed their family. Lying is my favorite one when it comes to morality. There are times when lying is the most moral thing you can possibly do. Right? Everybody knows everybody's heard a million times, the idea of, hiding Jews in the attic in World War II Germany, right?
Right.
The Nazis come and knock on the door. The most moral thing you can do is lie to the Nazis. If you are honest with those individuals, it will result in the death of other people. If
Right.
you lie to them, you will preserve life. And if there is a God, and if that God judges me for saving life, I don't want anything to do with that. He is morally inferior to me.
So, a lot of interesting points there. Dean, did you have anything you wanted to add before I go?
No, that's perfect.
Okay. So one interesting thing in that latter point, it's interesting the way that you would phrase that. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but it was the most moral thing you can do, right?
Absolutely.
And I would agree with that statement as stated. I do not agree that the statement is necessarily moral per se. I think that in the situation, you have a choice between something bad and something worse. So you go with something bad rather than something worse. And I would put that at the default of that. Your lie in that instance, in my personal ethical framework, if we choose to call it that, would be laid actually at the feet of the Nazi for putting you in such a situation, and not at you for doing the thing, which would be otherwise considered immoral.
And
right?
That makes perfect sense from your perspective, right? Because from your worldview perspective, the act of lying is still sinful, right? Right? I'm not burdened with that, right? Like, I look at it purely from a moral perspective, right? So is it, am I, like Dean alluded to first, am I increasing well-being, minimizing harm, things like that. Though in that particular instance, the lie is actually elevated to moral behavior from my perspective.
Right.
Like that would actually be the moral thing to do. Because I'm not burdened with Jesus is over my shoulder watching what I do, right? Of course, I don't believe that that's the case, right? So, it's like, are there instances where lying is immoral? Yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't have any problem saying that, right? Is there time, like we talked before, are there times that stealing is immoral? Absolutely. Are there times that stealing is moral? That's a different question. So, if we talked about the person stealing to feed their family, right? There's still a negative impact on the store owner that the person steals from. So what I would say in that instance, the theft is still immoral, but it is justifiable given the situation.
So, and the reason I point this difference out, which I appreciate you building upon it here as well, is because fundamentally, what we have here is a disagreement about whether or not actions in and of themselves can be immoral, is what it sounds like to me, right? In other words, your actions, your value judgment on the morality of an action is very context dependent, and mine would not be. Is that fair?
Dean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. It is context dependent because, like you're saying with the lying, right? Depending on the context, it either is immoral or moral.
Yeah. It's like so like in the United States, right? And so for everyone who's not familiar, go into Standing for Truth channel, look in his back catalog. CJ and I had a debate on the 10 Commandments. What is that, 3-4 years ago now? A long time ago.
Yeah, like 2021 maybe.
Yeah, long time ago. Anyway, but from a biblical perspective, right? Thou shalt not murder, right? Canada has way different laws than the U.S.
Right.
But it's my understanding that in certain states in the U.S., I'm not sure about where you are, but there's this thing called the castle doctrine, right? Where if somebody enters your home, you can just smoke them.
Yes, and that is a law where I live. Yes.
Right. So would that still be? Would you view that in the same way we view it? So it's immoral, but it's justifiable, or would you still just call it still? This is just what I did was absolutely wrong.
So I tend to see it there's a little bit of overlap between the moral but justifiable that you're saying and the immoral but your options are bad or worse thing that I'm saying as it pertains to examples like that, right? So like as an example, I think that taking human life is never good. It's never a moral thing. It's sometimes a necessary thing, unfortunately. And when it is a necessary thing, it is necessary because some other agent has put you in a position where you no longer have a choice. The example I tend to give is very similar to the one breaking into your house, right? But I always ask, if you're a husband or a parent or a brother or whatever, somebody's attacking and you have every reason to believe with lethal force, your loved one, do you pull the trigger, right? And most people will say yes. Now, I've met some particularly pacifist individuals who would say, I want to try and find a situation out of it. They're very rare. Most people I see tend to say yes. But to me, that's not a situation where we're saying, okay, is that killing moral? It's more of a situation of like, what's worse? Is it worse for you to, and especially in a position as somebody who has a responsibility to protect. So if you're the older brother, given my view of patriarchy, if you're the husband, or maybe that could even be your guys' view too. You don't necessarily have to be a patriarch to believe men have a duty to protect women. If you're a parent, certainly, I think everybody believes that we have a duty to protect a parent, right? The option, what's the worst option? What's the most immoral option? You foregoing your duties as a protector, or you taking that person's life? In my instance, I'd say because these moral actions have definitive value, I can say with conviction that it's one or the other, and in this case, it'd be taking the life is the better option, right? I still don't think that's a good or moral option, though. I just think that you don't have a third way. Think of it like the trolley issue, right? For those who don't know, the trolley problem is you have a train.
It's terrible. The trolley problem is terrible.
It sucks. Both options suck in the trolley option, right? Or in the trolley scenario. I just used the word. Come on. Problem. There it is. In the trolley problem, right, for those who are unfamiliar, you have a train that, due to no fault of your own, you were uninvolved, or a trolley, right, is going to kill 5 people. Now, you can divert it from killing 5 people, but if you do, it will kill 1. Why is this a problem? You did not murder the 5 if you let it go, right? But it's the case that 5 individual lives are lost, but you had nothing to do with it. You did murder the 1 if you divert, but also only 1 life is lost over and against 5, right? Now, that particular scenario, I'm not 100% sure what the answer would be, but that scenario is the same general line of reasoning that I'm getting at right now, right? Where it's like, it's not that either option is moral. It's that if both options have a legitimate moral value, then we should be able to figure out which option is more moral. And if I have to choose one, I'm going to go with the one that it gives me you could say less of a sin debt, so to speak. Mm-hmm. That's obviously an analogy, but I digress.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, your rationale is going to come from the same place that Dean's and mine will come from. right? It's exactly the same. I will say also, interestingly enough, when I was having a debate discussion with Praise on Donnie's channel, I presented the trolley problem to him, and he tried to get out of it by saying, "Oh, I'd throw myself on the tracks and sacrifice myself," and be like, "That's not one of the options." Right, like
There's no
that's
guarantee that would work. Given
well, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, that's
also
also not
5 people. Why can't it go through 6? Like,
yeah. So, but it's I mean, but we would do the same thing. Dean and I would say degree of well-being and harm reduction, right? And there's all kinds of like this is why morality is, guys, like everybody listening in the audience, everybody who'll see this video later. That's why morality isn't black and white. Because morality is dirty, it's sticky. If you have time to look at the situation, say, well, is it 5 elderly people? Is it 1 young person, or is it vice versa? Right?
Yeah. Is it 5 criminals and one
exactly.
Nobel Prize winner?
Are there children? Right? Are there children involved? Is it all women? Is it a pregnant woman? Right? There's a multitude of options, and that's why morality is so dirty and sticky and not so black and white. But I will say one other thing that is really interesting is that at the beginning of this, you said you were a moral absolutist, and having this discussion, I don't think you're a moral absolutist at all.
Brief moment. I will comment on that, but some people have been very generous to me and giving me their money, so I need to read them. Alyosha, thank you, says, let's not forget we're all speaking as Westerners. True. A couple thousand years of legal science and sense of fairness on board. So we're kind of discussing shades of Christian ethics. That's actually deeply fascinating to me, because I think that's probably true. Now, I'm interested. You guys are the actual
hindsight is 2020.
So I'm interested in knowing your guys' opinion. But like, for example, Richard Dawkins recently said that he was happy to live in a culturally Christian area rather than an area that was culturally Muslim or Buddhist or something along those lines. And he's before that said, while he believes Darwinism and atheism and materialism are all true, he would hate if we built a society around those given its ethical implications. So I am curious, would you guys agree with me and Alyosha that it is a good thing we have a foundation of Christian ethics in the West, or would you not?
Dean, you start with it.
It's difficult to answer that question because we don't have anything to compare it against. Really. But I think if we could go back 1,000 years or 2,000 years, whatever you want, with the scientific understanding we have now, and we just stopped Christianity from ever forming, and we built upon a secular, worldview, I think we'd be centuries ahead of where we are now. We'd have colonies on Mars.
Maybe it's interesting. What now? I will say that Richard Dawkins is a funny guy.
He said some weird things recently.
He has said some weird things, especially recently, much differently. So about 8 years ago, I sat at a table with him at a conference, and I didn't have lunch with Richard Dawkins. I was at the same table as him and 12 other people. He was a little more or a little less controversial. He said, like Dean said, he said some weird stuff lately. I also don't have a problem in saying I am happier living in a culturally Christian nation than a culturally Muslim nation. And I've said this on many platforms, on many occasions, to many people. It is my firm belief that in its radical form, Islam presents the greatest existential threat to humanity. Christianity is not far off, if you think about things like the Inquisition and stuff like that. But certainly, with access to the kind of weaponry and things like that, and, there's no history of Christians flying planes into buildings at 400 miles an hour. But I don't have a problem admitting that I'm happier living in a culturally Christian country. Ironically enough, the third line in the preamble of the Canadian Constitution recognizes the supremacy of Almighty God. The US Constitution is irreligious in every way, shape, and form. And ironically, Canada is almost infinitely more secular than the US is. I am fortunate enough to live in a neighborhood of vast diversity. So I taught lots of different people. I have so I'm facing the right way. Yeah. I have a fundamentalist Pentecostal Christian neighbor on this side, and I have a Hindu neighbor on this side. Right. And they're both lovely families, absolutely lovely families. I consider myself fortunate enough to be surrounded with this degree of diversity. So I think it, in its worst forms, Christianity, I won't say, Christianity and Christians have done some really bad stuff, right? So have lots of other people. I feel like I'm rambling now. Ayosha, I hope I answered your question, but I'm not sure that I did.
Yeah, and I, by the way, just so you know, I have a note here about your last point so that we don't forget it. The one before I clicked on these super chats. Yeah. Jamie says CJ is pregnant. Thank you, Jamie. No, we are expecting though, so that's cool.
Congratulations!
Thank you.
Congratulations, very much.
And thank you, Jamie, for contributing to the milk money, right? And we have Alyosha again. I think she's just clarifying the last comment. If we were speaking in Micheal or Mumbai, it'd be a very different discussion.
We wouldn't be having this discussion.
Right.
I mean, there are people that I know that I've met at a couple of different conferences. They live in Canada in secret because their lives are threatened. Right. So, and this is something I've spoken with a lot of people of different Islamic traditions, whether it be Shia, Sunni, etc. And they say that, for example, women wearing a hijab or burqa, stuff like that, is a choice. And I mock them. I mock them openly. Because I say, no, it's a choice because of where you're standing now, to Ayosha's point. Go to Afghanistan, go to Iran, and take it off. You're not going to do it. Because you'll either get beaten within an inch of your life or you'll get killed.
Yeah, I guess if you want to get super philosophical about it, it's a choice in the sense that you have a choice between wearing it and dying.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that's... And I think... There's one more, also from Alyosha. Thank you very much, Alyosha. You're being incredibly generous right now. I appreciate that. Even at the point of secular, to Tom Holland's point, not the actor, the historian, even the origins of that notion is a Christian invention. And I do think these questions or these points are very interesting to me. You pointed out earlier in answering the first super chat, Michael, that even though your country acknowledges God in its preamble to its constitution, was it the preamble?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Even though it acknowledges God in the preamble to its constitution, it seems to be significantly less secular, whereas the American Constitution does not, and it seems to be only about 13% of the population considers itself to be evangelical or fundamentalist. But 68% considers itself to be Christian. And then, of course, you have Jews, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhists, etc. on top of that. About 22% are religious non. So about 78% of the population of America is religious in some capacity, only 10% being non-Christian religion. And, there's various questions about where you throw Mormonism and Catholicism and stuff like that. I digress. It is interesting to me that from a historical perspective and from a perspective of political philosophy, the United States, first off, is deeply rooted in Protestant ethics, particularly. And I think a lot of the ideas about like separations of powers and separation of church and state, as originally understood, that idea has since evolved. But as the founders had understood it, exception Jefferson, he's unique even back then, tends to be very much grounded in Calvinism. Actually, the things that Calvin and Knox and Theodore Beza, right? Even John Locke was a philosopher primarily, but he was a Calvinist as well. Leibniz was also a Calvinist, right? And while I think that's true of the rest of the Western democracies, it's almost like that evolution kind of, you could say, culminated in the United States, and then the United States exported its ideas elsewhere after that. Now, Britain is already very influential to the United States itself. You know, guys like Edmund Burke and John Locke and Adam Smith, they would all be, you know, one of the different British cultures, whether they be English or Scottish or what have you. But even a lot of the ideas that were come up with here ended up being exported back to Britain and France to a large extent. The French Revolution probably doesn't happen without, granted, the French Revolution took a wild turn, mostly to the left in that regard. But it does start very much with this idea of the American Revolution. Canada, of course, was very influenced by the American Revolution. In fact, fun fact, a lot of people don't know this, the United States invaded Canada twice. Failed both times, but did so twice. Once in the Revolution, once in the War of 1812.
And then we came
and do it again.
Down.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. And
you might be invading us again.
Well, hopefully not. But I get your point, definitely. Anyways, my point, let me wrap up because I'm rambling. My point here is to say it does seem to me like Protestant ethic has given birth to the very concept of religious freedom, separation of church and state, and so on and so forth. Whereas, you know, a lot of I agree with Dean with what he said earlier. It's not as if we have a secular tradition to look back on per se, but part of that I think is because that arises out of the Protestant ethic, and in areas where you have atheism taking over without a Protestant ethic, right? It doesn't end up very much like Iceland. It's obviously the Soviet Union or communist China. Now, I don't know if that's coincidental. They're both atheists, but one of them has a different foundation than the other, right? Iceland is a very atheist country, but its foundation was primarily in the same foundation as America's, whereas China's not so much, right? Anyway, I rambled there for a minute.
Yeah, I don't think you can find a couple of countries more diametrically opposed than Canada and China.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we are much more in the kind of Northern European that you alluded to prior to China. Like there's a distinction to be made, and it's an important one. The difference, the nuance, and I know that you understand this, CJ, but there are many people sadly that don't. The differences, the galaxy of differences between communism and socialism. Like quite, you know, and I am only being a little hyperbolic when I say galaxies of difference, because there are vast differences between those two things. I'm not going to, you know, I shouldn't have to espouse on the differences. Pick up some literature and read about it. There are, like, for example, there are tons of, and I've said this to many people that I speak to on a regular basis on forums like Clubhouse, etc. There are many people who look at places like Canada and say, oh, you know, like we were talking before about, you know, Joe Rogan said, you know, there are things we can't do in Canada, which is just laughable. Like Joe Rogan, in saying those things, he demonstrated how little he knows, like just how little he knows about our glorious country. But there are so many socialized programs that the U.S. has, right? Everything from garbage collection to snow plows now apparently that you need in Florida because of climate change. Street lights, parks, libraries, public schools.
Police officers.
Yeah, EMS, right? Would you really want to have, like, when you, the next time somebody, and this would be for anybody who's watching or listening to this later, would you really want to have to, when you call 911, ask how much they charge for a service call? Of course not. That was rhetorical. But these are all socialized programs, right? All the socialism aspect of it is just it's administered by the government. That's all it means, right? People who don't understand our healthcare system, for example, which is not perfect, but I can never lose my house because I can't pay my bills because I got sick. So there's a, and now I'm CJ. It's contagious. I'm rambling now. But there's just this galaxy of differences, right, between these things. My whole point to me, much closer to the northern European countries than China.
Yeah, and I do wonder how much of that has to do with the foundation of Protestant ethic over and against. Now, I don't know, would you consider Russia's to be, their foundation is an Orthodox ethic. It's not a secular ethic, even though it went that direction, right? So there's, to a certain extent, I guess we're not saying a whole lot as far as solving the problem. But anyways, not wanting to get too deep in that, unless anybody else wants to say anything, which you can. I'm not saying you can't. We can jump right back where we left off with Michael's question.
Which was what? I forget.
I don't even remember.
That's exactly why I wrote it down, because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have either.
Oh, right. Moral absolutist.
Yes. So you were talking about you don't think necessarily that I would be a absolutist given this conversation.
No, given what you said early on and the ensuing conversation, I'm convinced you're not a moral absolutist.
So let me kind of lay out, I think, why I would not consider that to be true, right? So, well, obviously, right, I wouldn't be having this conversation. So I alluded to earlier this idea that consequentialism to me it doesn't make any sense. Now, for those who don't know, consequentialism is utilitarianism. And if you're just saying, Jay, you just used a word I don't know to describe a word I don't know. The means justify the ends, right? If you do something that would ordinarily be considered bad, it may be considered good if the ends are in fact good, right?
So sorry. So you said means justify the ends. You meant ends justify means?
Yes. Sorry. That is exactly correct. Ends justify the means. Thank you for catching that. So consequentialism.
I don't agree with that in any way, shape, or form. I do not agree with ends and the ends justify the means.
Yeah, and I think it can be. I think that can be a complicated question in and of itself. But the reason I bring it up is to say one thing I've always pointed out when talking to people who are consequentialists, because that's typically taken as like a third view in between moral objectivism and moral subjectivism is consequentialism. And I've always pointed out that you've really just kicked the can down the road because you haven't actually told me whether or not morality is subjective or is objective. And you haven't told me what justifies something being right or wrong because you say the ends justify the means, but who is to say the ends are good and the means are bad? How did you get there? How did you come to that conclusion, right? All right, what's the point, Jay? Well, I think if you have a system of objective, absolute morals, essentially morals are value judgments, right? And so if I have a $1 bill and a $5 bill, the $5 bill is worth more, right? Because it's a value of $5 over and against a value of $1. I know somebody in the live chat is going to say, well, that's not necessarily an objective thing. Don't read too much into the analogy. I'm only pointing out certain values are greater than other values, right? And I tend to see morality in a similar way. If we can agree that moralities have value, the moralities are value judgments, and if those value judgments are objective and concrete, then we can say definitively that value A is more valuable than value B, right? Because those values are set in stone as a matter of fact. So in a roundabout sort of way, what I'm saying is these things these questions of moral absolutism, the things I bring up, they may sound like they're not morally absolutist, but I actually think they are the consistent version of moral absolutism and consequentialism. And I'd add to that, the way I worded the lying to the Nazi thing is your choices are bad or worse, but they're not the lie suddenly became good, right? And that's a extension of this belief about moral absolutism, where I'm saying because there's a certain value I attach to lie, there's no situation in which lie becomes benign or good. But there is a situation in which lie, maybe you could call that for to put some numbers on it just to make it easier to understand. If you called lie -2 and give up the Jews in the attic -10, well, I'd rather be down -2 than -10, provided I have no other options, right? So that's kind of what why I would say it's not that it's not absolutist. It's more like a variation of absolutist, if that makes sense.
It just sounds like you kind of said kicking the can down the road. The way I look at it is it's entirely, and this is something where we, not to be too much of a go along to get along kind of thing, but we understand that your stance on this is worldview dependent, right? Because if either one of us, like I mentioned before, if either one of us does an internal critique of the other's perspective, like if you for a moment take off your sunglasses and put on the no God glasses, right? You could for a second, then the problem goes away, right? Lying would, in the instance of the Nazis, become like you would be like, yeah, I totally agree with Michael and Dean. In this instance, it's a good thing that I lied because I saved lives, right? Whereas if we step inside your view, we understand that from an absolutist perspective, why is lying wrong? Because God said so. So I lied, and that's wrong. But, and I'll just take it through the progression because I've already been in your shoes, right? But Jesus died on the cross for me, and so he covered he covered the sin that I committed, and so I'll pray to God in Jesus' name and ask for His forgiveness for my moment of weakness, and we good.
So I grant a certain level of your point. In other words, there's an extent to which, you say, if you were to be in our position, there would be no problem. And in that instance, I think I would kind of agree that there is no necessary dilemma if one is to say lying is wrong, if one's not a moral absolutist, because like I said earlier, it's very context dependent, right? My problem with a context-dependent morality, or even if you wanted to be even more precise than that, to say a context-dependent morality which seeks to benefit well-being above all things, is that I don't necessarily know what. How do I want to put this? It doesn't seem to me like morality truly exists on that worldview in any way beyond majority rules or might makes right. Now, at the moment, majority happens to agree that well-being is a positive thing, and the governments or the might happen to back up what the majority says, which is a good thing, by the way. I don't think that's a problem. It's also subject to change at a moment's notice, though. I'm not a Trump fan. I also don't think he's as bad as some of his detractors would say. Hypothetically, though, let's say he is. And all of a sudden, Native Americans start losing citizenship and Mexicans start showing up in concentration camps and stuff like that. Now, let's say that through some fluke of history, something happens to where the American, Canadian, and European people are all kind of, okay, that makes sense. That sounds like a good idea, which is totally possible, by the way. If you asked in 1933 Germany if they'd be Holocausting people, that they'd be like, absolutely not. But according to studies, by 1945, about 76% of the population of Germany thought that killing people was killing ethnic groups for being ethnic groups was at least in some cases justified, right? So it's only 12 years, and all of a sudden, Hitler's brainwashing has done a really good job, right? So it's 100% possible something like this could happen. At that point, I don't necessarily know how one could argue that it is immoral for the Trump government in that scenario to do what he would be doing, as much as it would be something that is not maybe preferable, pleasing, something along those lines. And before somebody were to say something along the lines of, well, does that maximize well-being? Well, well-being is kind of a fickle thing, right? One of the reasons why Hitler is such a good example in these things is because he genuinely believed to his core that he was maximizing well-being. One of the
Well, there's two points: it's maximizing well-being and reduction of harm.
Yeah, there's two separate things. Yeah.
Well, granted,
and they are intrinsically linked. They are intrinsically linked.
Exactly.
You cannot separate those two things because
it's not a promotion of well-being above all else.
Yeah.
It is linked with reduction of harm.
Yeah, because and like with the Hitler thing is like he was just demonstrably wrong, right? And everybody watching this now, the three of us, we all agree he was wrong, and the reason we can say he's wrong, completely absent anyone saying, here are the edicts of the things you must do and the things you must not do, is because we can use the standard of well-being and harm reduction and involuntary imposition of will and the other things that I mentioned before. We can use those. We can measure that, right? You can think, you can even be convinced due to severe mental illness that drinking battery acid is good for you. You're just wrong about that. Like, it doesn't matter what you think. Like you are measurably, demonstrably wrong. And even though 76% of the German population thought that was the case, they were just wrong about that. And we don't need to appeal to anything outside of that, because we just have this body of evidence right at our feet that we can just say, well, okay, well, why? And this is what happens a lot of times. People say, how can you say that? What's your, and this is where, you start to get into some things when you start talking with particularly dishonest believers, and they start chucking in things like ultimate standard or all these other different kinds of things, which are just buzzwords that don't really mean anything. Because I don't know what the difference between those things are anyway. Like to put the prefix ultimate in front of something doesn't mean anything. It's just fluff. So we can just see that these things are the way they are, and we can look at them and we can compare them with anything else. We can compare the individual drinking battery acid to the individual drinking a protein shake, and we can just say one is just clearly better than the other. One is promoting well-being and reducing harm at the same time. The other one is not only not promoting well-being, but causing harm and suffering at the same time.
So, first of all, I think I am remiss if I don't mention that's not the right usage of the word, is it? Maybe it is. I don't know. Tired guys, don't judge me.
Yeah,
that sounds rather objective to me, right? So that does kind of put you in a place where it seems like morality is getting a little bit more objective than we might have initially said.
No, right? Not at all. Not at all. Like, because there has to be buy-in, right? There has to be buy-in. You have to care and I have to care, right? There are those in our society, psychopaths, for example, right? Who lack the brain biology, who lack the mirror neurons which is the part of our brain biology that actually allows us to feel empathy, right? They lack that. They don't have that part of their brain. They don't have the capacity for that type of abstract thought. And so it's not the case. But even if because that person that is drinking the battery acid, even though we can say, we could say, I suppose, that it is objectively the case, it is still that person's opinion. It is still his subjective opinion that he's doing a good job for himself.
Right, but his subjective opinion doesn't really do anything for whether or not him drinking battery acid is good, right? Like, you can believe all you'd like. The reality is you're going to die pretty soon.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Burning means it's working.
Right. So, and that's why I say it seems like, regardless of whether or not there's buy-in, because there'd be instances on my worldview, I can grant that there needs to be buy-in in order for societies to actually function morally, or in order for my morality to be put into practice, or things along those lines, right? But because I see morals as a system of facts, that's ultimately a secondary question. If there's no buy-in, it doesn't necessarily matter because they're just all immoral.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is a point where people can have areas of disagreement, right? Because I also, I remember when Matt was on the podcast, Matt Slick was on the podcast a few months ago. And I have said in other discussions with him and with other discussions where he has come up in conversation. Matt is somewhat famous or infamously known for saying the following: it is always wrong to torture a baby merely for one's own personal pleasure. Everybody who's familiar with Matt Slick has heard him say that.
Yeah, 100 times actually, right? It's very, like you say, he's very famous for it.
I agree with that sentiment. I actually agree that moral facts exist. I am not a strict subjectivist. And this is where it's funny, because when you start talking to people who are atheists and stuff like that, again, it's people talk about, the prongs of a fork, right? Atheism is a chopstick. It's not a fork, right? It's an answer to a single question. Everything else is something else. So you can have two people that do not believe that a God exists. One person will be a complete moral subjectivist. It's just based on opinion, right? And another person will be a moral objectivist and say, I believe some moral facts exist. I sit kind of in the middle. I think a lot of things are based on opinion, but I think that there are still some moral facts that exist. Like, it's always wrong to torture a baby merely for one's own personal pleasure. I agree with that sentiment. I would say that is a moral fact.
So and that's an interesting point in and of itself that creates my little one point there, right? Where it's like, I think maybe we're not as opposed to objectivism per se, but the other thing, because this is the reason I like why use the Hitler example? Why not Stalin or something like that, right? And part of the reason I use the Hitler example is because social Darwinism, for those who don't know, Nazism as an ideology is very much grounded in the concept of social Darwinism, right? Whereby that you use things like eugenics to create an ideal human species. Now, in Nazism's case, that is also heavily influenced by racialism. So it's not necessarily just tallest, strongest, healthiest, but it's also like, the quote unquote Aryan blood, which is stupid anyway, because Aryan people are Indian, but that's not the point. In their worldview, and not just the worldview of Nazis, but of social Darwinists generally, that is actually what they're doing, is creating human flourishing and reducing human suffering. Now, I know somebody might say, okay, but the 6 million dead Jews and numerous other millions of dead people who were not Jews would beg to differ, right? And this is where I like to bring up what I call the Rorschach dilemma. Have you guys ever seen Watchmen? No? Okay.
Yeah, I hate it. Yeah, I hated it. I thought it was hot garbage.
So,
but I'm familiar with the Rorschach tests.
Okay. Yeah. So and by the way, I do see the private chat there, guys. Absolutely, yeah. You certainly can. So Rorschach Dilemma, as I title it, is just basically that end scene of the movie. For those in the audience who don't know, or if you've watched the comic, it's slightly different, or read the comic rather, it's slightly different, but they're both the same general idea, right? One of the characters, Ozymandias, being a utilitarian, in fact, he's kind of a caricature of utilitarianism, wipes out like 20 million people across the globe in simultaneous attacks in Russia and the United States. In the comic, he blames an alien octopus. In the movie, it's one of the other characters, Dr. Manhattan. But nevertheless, the point being, throughout the movie, Russia and the United States have been actively at a state of hostility with each other, and they're just this close to nuclear war, right? And what Ozymandias does is he wipes these guys out, blames it on some outside force, and the hope is that he will bring them together by doing so, and thus the doomsday clock goes backwards, right? Now, one of the things that in my opinion is one of the strengths of this movie is that it works. He not only successfully kills them, but Russia and the United States do become allied with each other and do start trying to build up against this other threat. Like I said, in the case of the comic, it's Alien, and in the case of the movie, it's one of the other characters, Dr. Manhattan, right? And Rorschach basically says, I don't care if it's successful. The murder of 10 to 20 million people is wrong. So you guys, he famously says, keep your own secrets, walks out, and then they end up killing him to preserve their little lie here. Now, here's the dilemma, right? And this is very important to the concept of social Darwinism. Ozymandias' view actually has increased from a net perspective, human flourishing, and decreased human suffering. It was the 10 to 20 million or the possibility of a nuclear war, right? Rorschach's perspective disregards the well-being for what he would consider to be the objective facts of the matter. Killing 20 million people is wrong, right? Not only is that a very interesting dilemma for us, but that's also precisely what we see in social Darwinism. Their view is, okay, I break a dozen eggs now, and I hate to just so dismissively refer to human lives as a dozen eggs, but please take that in the spirits it's intended.
Especially with the price of eggs in the U.S. right now.
No kidding, right? And by the way,
I'm still only paying $4 for a dozen eggs, by the way.
Well, bird flu and all that, plus some of the economic issues, but I digress. Their idea is break the dozen eggs now. 100 years from now, human beings will flourish and be more, will be less subject to suffering than they currently are. In the case of the Nazis, obviously that involves a lot of racialism, but there are plenty of eugenicists who were not Nazis. And in fact, it's actually still on the books in American law. It is legal to forcibly sterilize the mentally handicapped and people with genetic disorders. That, by the way, anybody who's in the United States, you need to have just as much fury about what I just said as you would about anything else in American law, because that's disgusting. That said, that is still on the books in American law, because back in 1927, when it was passed, that was part of the whole eugenicist idea.
Yeah, it was in our books for a long time. It was done in a lot of what was terribly coined insane asylums. It was done there. It was done to people with Down syndrome. It was done to lots of people here. It is now no longer on our books, thankfully. But yeah, like both of our societies have histories that we should necessarily be proud of. Social Darwinism is a terrible thing. I would side with Rorschach in this example. I don't think you can rationalize that type of thing and say, it's for the betterment, right? That is still it's a challenging question to try to rationalize. And it's a bigger, more, dastardly version of the trolley problem, right? Both suck.
It's also, we don't know that's the only option.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
Well, and I guess I appreciate you saying you take Rorschach's view there, assuming that they were the only options, just for sake of argument. would you still feel that way?
Yes.
And the reason I appreciate that. That to me seems like more something, because I agree. I would also take Rorschach's side in that. In fact, I named my dog Rorschach after that movie. That to me sounds like something that's more on my side of ultimately benefiting net. How do I say this? An increase in net human flourishing and decrease in net suffering, if it costs 20 million lives, is not worth it, because the murder of 20 million people is just wrong, flatly. And it sounds to me like you'd agree with that sentiment, but
I agree with it. Yeah,
I'm not entirely sure though. If it's a difference between 20 million lives and the potential end of humans entirely.
The problem is that how do you, and this is where it gets really sticky, and for what I said before, guys, remember, morality is sticky, right? How do you decide? Right? Who wants to be that person who's flipping through the files and say, does this person live versus that person? Right? All these different things. And this is why, like, when you think about even Richard Dawkins, for all of his faults that we talked about a couple of times, Richard Dawkins has gone on the record saying, a Darwinistic type of society is the last place he would want to live, because it would be vicious.
Yeah, red and
right?
well.
And so like this is the kind of thing where, I mean, like, again, to reiterate the sentiment that I made, right? You talk about the epitome of a terrible trolley problem, right? Killing off 10 to 20 million people. Who decides that? No, thank you.
So would it be fair? And I want this to be actually the last point. So whatever you say after this, I won't be responding to, because I know that we have to hop off here pretty soon. Would it be fair to say in that regard, and I think if I'm understanding correctly, there may be a difference of opinion here betwixt you and Dean, which is perfectly fine, of course, each your own individual. Would it be fair to say that, how do I want to put this? Do you see why I see Darwinism as the logical conclusion of what we're looking for is a net gain in human flourishing and net decrease in human suffering? Can you see where I'm getting to that direction? And if you can, how would you get around that, given your view on morality? If you don't, why?
Do you want to go first?
I can see where you're getting at. Yeah, I mean, I coming from your worldview, I see how you're getting there, but I don't know what else to say about that.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. Like, I see where you're coming from, but it's hard, because when you start to chuck in the whole kind of Darwinian type of thing, and my brain immediately goes to evolution and stuff like that as well. And I think I think these are drastically different things, and so I understand where like, I understand how you're getting there, but I don't think that. What's the best way to? I'm trying to think of the best way to put this without and still be respectful. Well, we'll just chuck it out there and take in the manner which it's intended.
Yeah.
So I think pawning it off on the idea that it is the way it is because God said so is just a cop-out. And I think it is a convenient way of getting around the stickiness of what we talked about before, a very ugly situation.
Well, and with that, I said I wouldn't respond to that so that we could go ahead and shut this down, and I won't. So with that, I think I want to go ahead and say thank you guys for
this has been great.
Yeah, let's do it again.
Yeah, this has been great. We'll absolutely do it again. We'll have to have you back on. The show as well to do some.
And maybe I can be there this time.
Right. Absolutely, man. And by the way, Michael, of course, you already know this because this is like the 12 millionth time. I'm just kidding. But Dean, also, I was very pleased to make your acquaintance, and you're absolutely welcome back here anytime.
Yeah,
Thanks, sir.
I just like to say, just in closing, I've said this on each of the times that I've been here, and I believe I've said it each of the times when you've joined us on our podcast, and that is to everybody that's watching this now and everyone that will watch it later. Pay attention to what just happened. Okay, what you had here is you had three people, well, two groups of people, CJ being the Christian, and us being the heathens, right? Vehemently disagreeing, right? Diametrically opposed, I said at the beginning. And what didn't we do? We didn't attack each other. We didn't call each other names. We were respectful of each other and respectful of each other's opinions, even though we disagree. If as groups of people, believers and non-believers, if we could do a lot more of that, that'd be good.
I was going to say the same thing. It was a very enjoyable discussion. I like having discussions where you get to think and you get different perspectives and you get them all that around in your head. And this was a very respectful, enlightening conversation. It was amazing.
100%. But it's your channel, CJ, so you say the last word.
Well, I'd say first off, I absolutely agree with that. And I think very often that these conversations are very excellent. Of course, you know, in a way, whoever decides to go onto the other's platform is stepping into their own little version of a lion's den. So I always appreciate you guys. You know, you're not going to find anybody in the live chat right now that's agreeing with you. And if we were on, you know, I guess you guys have a podcast, so it wouldn't be a channel. But the same would be true in the other way, right? So I appreciate that you guys are willing to do that, knowing that that is going to be the case. I also appreciate that, you know, for the most part, I do think that my audience, and I guess I'm not sure your audience just because I don't know them. You guys would know better than I, but if it's true of yours, that is awesome as well. Tend to be intellectually honest about these kinds of things. So I appreciate the audience here considering the positions as well. But yeah, there is a level of chutzpah that is necessary in order to have your views challenged on on hostile territory, so to speak, right? So I appreciate you guys demonstrating that, and I appreciate you being respectful and coming on here. Anything
record, I don't consider this hostile territory.
No.
You know, yeah. I mean, we've been doing this long enough, CJ. I consider you a friend.
And likewise, I very much appreciate your friendship as well, especially considering the implications it has for everybody else, right? As far as like this is something that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
I don't know you as well as Micheal does, CJ, but I can tell you're a good guy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And likewise, this is all very excellent, guys. And so with that, I will go ahead and say my usual outros. If you guys liked this video, please consider liking and sharing this video. Please consider subscribing if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every single time that we go live. Remember, there are tons of links in the comment section down below, including a link to my guest's podcast, the CA podcast. And, you know, of course, all the various other things that you'll find there. Also, please do consider checking out the breakfast teas over there on Patreon. Obviously, I understand not everybody's got the ability to contribute in that way, but there is some extra content there. So if you do, you'll be rewarded for it with some extra content. We don't have anything coming here soon, so I'll just go ahead and say if the Lord wills and tarries, we'll be seeing you guys here soon. I don't know exactly when, but it will be soon. And yeah, shalom.
I said, won't it be a time?